The man known to history as Vyacheslav Molotov was born, according to the Julian calendar, on the 25th of February, 1890, in the village of Kakara in the Vyatka Governorate region of Russia, on the west side of the Ural Mountains, still theoretically in Europe, though hundreds of kilometers east of St. Petersburg and Moscow. His baptismal name was Vyacheslav Mikhaevich Scriabin. Molotov was a pen name he would adopt in later life. Because of the changing calendar systems used in Russia in the first decades of his life, Vyacheslav's date of birth is also often given as the 9th of March, 1890, according to the Gregorian calendar, which was in use throughout most of Europe, though not yet in Russia. A development which also creates the unusual situation where the October Revolution of 1917 happened in what was November in most other European countries. Vyacheslav's father was Mikhail Scriabin, a local shop worker in Kakara. His mother was Anna Scriabin. She came from a relatively affluent family of grocers, and Mikhail worked his way up through her family's business. Vyacheslav was the 9th of 10 children they would have, 3 of whom died in infancy. The Scriabin family were of above-average means while Vyacheslav was growing up, though even a relatively affluent family in rural Vyatka in the late 19th century did not live particularly well by modern standards. Young Vyacheslav was first sent to school in the town of Nolinsk. Here, he was a gifted pupil of clearly above-average intellect, though shy and retiring. In his spare time, he helped out in the family business and became a precocious reader of books and pamphlets on social and political matters in Europe and Russia. As he grew up, the perception of him was of an uptight individual, but one who would become a very efficient administrator and organizer. Skills which propelled him to the forefront of Russian politics over time. Behind the visage of a seemingly inoffensive individual, who dressed sharply but attracted little fanfare, was a young man with strong ambitions peering out from his ever-present spectacles. Molotov's political awakening within this extremely tense Russian political atmosphere came early, in 1906, when he was still just a teenager. He developed an association with the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a radical Russian socialist party which was gaining in strength in the aftermath of the 1905 revolution in Russia, an abortive revolution which had resulted from political repression and the disastrous Russo-Japanese War. This had led Tsar Nicholas II to promise political reforms and the creation of a Russian Duma or parliament, only to try everything possible afterward to block reform of the autocratic system. The Social Democratic Labour Party was the forerunner of the Russian Communist Party and would later split into two factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks being the more radical and aggressive faction, and one which would increasingly come to be led by Vladimir Lenin while he was in exile in Western Europe in the 1900s and into the 1910s. Vyacheslav gravitated over time towards the more radical Bolsheviks. He began writing for the party in the late 1900s. It was in this capacity that he adopted the pen name Molotov that he would forevermore become known by. Molotov derives from the Russian word Malay, meaning hammer, giving his adopted name an industrial sound and also a sense of a person who aimed to break down political conventions in a revolutionary manner. It was not unusual for revolutionary writers during this time to adopt pen names in this way. Lenin himself adopted his own name most likely from the river Lena. Molotov's revolutionary activities initially played out in the Kazan region, where he operated under the pseudonym Dyadia, meaning uncle, in order to avoid detection by the Tsarist secret police. Before long, he was responsible for organizing the activities of the Kazan Revolutionary Youth Wing of the Bolsheviks there. Through these, he was involved in disseminating revolutionary ideas from the writings of Marx, Engels, and Russian Marxists, in groups of young revolutionaries that met clandestinely. He did not long avoid detection, and in the spring of 1909, he was arrested by the state security services and was exiled to Vologda province, where he spent the next 2 years, primarily in the town of Torma, a small town away from any railway lines where the internal exiles could be closely monitored. He continued his studies while here and passed his exams such that when his 2 years of exile ended, he was able to attend the Polytechnical Institute in St. Petersburg. There, he quickly returned to his work with the Bolsheviks, writing frequent contributions for the journal Zvezda, meaning star. He later contributed to the founding and early publications of the more well-known Bolshevik revolutionary journal Pravda, meaning truth. It was while working as part of the editorial and writing team for Pravda that he first met Joseph Stalin, a young Georgian revolutionary, and would have entered into correspondence with Leon Trotsky, a Jewish Russian intellectual who was living in exile like Lenin. Molotov himself continued to suffer persecution and frequent arrests in the Russian capital, culminating in his exile again in 1915, this time to Kutsk, in the desolate Russian east. Though sentenced to 3 years of internal exile here on this occasion, in 1916, he escaped and headed back westward to Kazan and the Volga region. Molotov's life course would be profoundly shaped by the events of the mid-1910s, as it would be for so many Russians and Eastern Europeans during the 20th century. The Russian Empire was critical in the outbreak of the First World War. It was Russian support for the autonomy of the Kingdom of Serbia in the face of Austrian demands to be allowed to enter Serbian territory, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serb nationalist, which circuitously led to the outbreak of a pan-European war in the final days of July and first days of August 1914. When the conflict came, Russia was very badly prepared for it and incurred a major defeat to Germany at the Battle of Tannenberg within weeks of the outbreak of the conflict. Things did not improve much thereafter. In particular, in the course of 1916 and into early 1917, the Russian front in Eastern Europe, where Tsar Nicholas II had taken the decision to command the army himself, collapsed. Around this time, this led to a revolution in St. Petersburg and Moscow in February 1917, one which began the overthrow of the old imperial system. Though the February Revolution was not led by radicals like the Bolsheviks, what it did do is create an environment in which the communists and various other groups began contemplating how they might seize power themselves in the highly fluid political situation in Russia in 1917. By the time the February Revolution occurred, Molotov was already back in St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd to avoid using the overly German-sounding St. Petersburg during the war with Germany. Here he returned to his work with Pravda during a period of immense change in the Bolshevik party operations. Figures like Lenin, Trotsky, and the other party leaders who had been in exile for many years were making their way back to Russia from Western and Central Europe, often actively supported by the German government, which was anxious to sow further instability in the Russian Empire. Over the next half a year, figures like Molotov were involved in forming Soviets, or workers' governing councils, in cities like Petrograd and Moscow, while also trying to plan the overthrow of the conservative revolutionaries that had come to power through the February Revolution. There was a constant fear of arrest and internment, and sometimes individuals had to disappear to Helsinki to avoid arrest. Overall, Molotov, in association with Stalin and several other members of the Bolshevik Petrograd Committee, was central in preparing Red Guard paramilitaries in the Petrograd factories, in preparation for the impending attempt by the Bolsheviks to seize power from the conservative government. The October Revolution was launched by the Bolsheviks in Petrograd on the 25th of October, 1917, according to the Julian calendar which was in use in Russia at that time, whereas most of Europe by then was operating under the new-style Gregorian calendar, according to which the start date of the revolution was the 7th of November. Just over 2 weeks earlier, the Petrograd Soviet had, under the influence of Leon Trotsky, voted for military action in protest against the course of the broader Russian Revolution since the spring. The interim regime in the capital was well aware that unrest was imminent and had moved to shut down the offices, newspapers, and the main transport routes in and out of the city on the 24th of October. Not to be dissuaded, the Bolshevik Red Guards began occupying government buildings across the city on the 25th, and the Winter Palace, the seat of government, was taken over the following day. By the end of the 27th of October, Petrograd, Minsk, Novgorod, Kazan, Ekaterinburg, and Samara were all under the control of the local workers' Soviets, though it was not until the 2nd of November that Moscow came under the control of the Bolsheviks after more than a week of intense fighting. The conflict in Moscow foreshadowed the Russian Civil War to come and indicated that the Bolshevik seizure of power would not be as straightforward across the vast country and empire as it had been in Petrograd and several other industrial cities in the West. Molotov was in Petrograd when the revolution began on the 25th of October and played a key role in directing the Red Guards there and organizing propaganda efforts. He was in the capital to witness the unfolding of the Russian Civil War, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. The initial seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in October 1917 was not a decisive one. While the Communists had claimed control of a number of major cities and formed workers' Soviets that would form the backbone of a new regime, they were not in control of vast parts of Russia, the largest country on earth, large proportions of which were only thinly controlled by the central government at the best of times. There were a great many groups which were opposed to the drift toward a more radical regime, not least the aristocratic and business classes, which were also supported strongly by the foreign governments of Britain, France, and the United States, none of which wanted the specter of a radical socialist regime in power in Petrograd and Moscow. Many other groups opposed the Bolsheviks for other reasons. Some were Mensheviks, some were regional interest groups such as the Cossacks of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and a great many were nationalists in parts of the Russian Empire like Finland, Estonia, and Poland. In the Russian Civil War which now began, and which would claim around a quarter of the number of people that died in the whole of the First World War, the Bolsheviks became known as the Reds, while the broad coalition of opponents to them were the Whites. There were a great many fronts stretching from the Pacific port of Vladivostok in the east to clashes with Finnish, Polish, and Ukrainian partisans in the west. Molotov was no soldier and did not play a frontline role in the Russian Civil War as a commander or general. He did play an important organizational and propaganda role, though. Early in 1918, just weeks after the October Revolution had seen the Bolsheviks claim power in both Petrograd and Moscow, he was appointed as chairman of the Council of National Economy in the Petrograd region. In this capacity, he played an important part in the nationalization of factories in one of the few parts of the burgeoning Soviet Union that had been extensively industrialized for many years. Much of this involved training workers how to run the factories which were now coming under collective ownership. The following year, he took part in a voyage down the river Volga, in which party members such as Molotov aimed to inform people from Moscow south to the Caspian Sea of the new benefits of communist rule. In the course of 1920, as the Soviets began to turn the tide in the Civil War, he served as chairman of the provincial executive in the Nizhny Novgorod region and later oversaw the industrialization of Donetsk and surrounding areas. A sign of his growing importance in the regime was his election late in 1920 as secretary of the Communist Party in the Ukrainian Soviet. In 1921, with the Bolsheviks finally moving towards victory in the Civil War, though with the loss of extensive territory in the West, specifically Finland, Estonia, and Poland, Molotov was elected as a secretary of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party, thus bringing him more clearly into the central leadership of the Soviet Union. He also became a junior member of the Politburo, though without voting rights in the latter body at this juncture. These followed in 1924. Molotov's entry into the central leadership necessarily brought him into the factional struggle that was developing at the top of the emerging Soviet state. There was no doubt that Lenin would be the Soviet Union's first leader when the October Revolution commenced in 1917. But before long, his health problems were becoming all too apparent, and a battle to succeed him was developing. It soon became evident that there were just two realistic candidates, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Molotov moved toward Stalin in this succession contest. His relationship with Trotsky seems to have been especially strained, though one particular anecdote of an interaction between them in the early 1920s is revelatory of Molotov's outlook, and was prescient of the future. During an argument between the pair, Molotov, responding to a sarcastic comment made towards him by Trotsky, rounded on Lenin's possible successor and rebuked him by saying, "Very well, Comrade Trotsky, we can all be geniuses, but we shall see who lasts the longest." For Molotov, politics was sometimes a game of survival, not always of overt intellect. He would survive far longer in it than Trotsky. By 1922, as Lenin's health deteriorated quickly, Stalin was leveraging his position as General Secretary of the Bolsheviks to put himself in a better position to succeed him as leader of the Soviet Union, which was completing the final stages of its victorious campaign in the Civil War. Molotov was effectively deputizing for Stalin as second secretary, and he firmly tied his mass to the Georgian who he had met so many years earlier in pre-revolutionary Georgia. Lenin died in January 1924 after having previously fallen into a coma. A more open power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky followed, one in which Molotov unsurprisingly continued to support Stalin, though he was critical of some of Stalin's views and conduct early on. This all occurred gradually. But by 1926, Stalin had completely outflanked Trotsky, gaining the support of the majority of the members of the Politburo, a process which accounts in part for the promotion of Molotov as a member thereof with full voting rights, who would support Stalin. Trotsky was removed from the Politburo that year and, in 1929, was exiled entirely from the Soviet Union, having already been sent into internal exile the previous year. Years later, after settling in Mexico and continuing to promote a purer form of Marxism abroad, Trotsky was assassinated in 1940. Despite the turbulence of the years of the Russian Civil War, Molotov married and started a family during the 1920s. During the revolution, he had met Paulina Solomonovna Zemchuzina, born Pearl Solomon Karapovskaya, a Jewish Russian woman who was a committed communist revolutionary herself and would rise to a fairly senior position within the Food Commissariat in the 1930s. She later adopted the name Paulina, a more Russified version of Pearl. She and Vyacheslav married in 1920, and she elected not to leave the Soviet Union for the British Mandate in Palestine, as several members of her family did during the 1920s. Her relationship with Molotov was remarked upon by many contemporaries, who viewed Vyacheslav as being dominated by his wife, though it could conversely be argued that theirs was simply a relatively equal relationship of considerable mutual admiration, one in which Paulina was simply more outwardly expressive than her reserved husband. Later, the contemporary criticism of the union would have very real consequences for both Molotov and his wife. They adopted a daughter named Sonia in 1929 and might have been surprised when Paulina finally fell pregnant not long afterwards, resulting in a biological daughter named Svetlana in 1930. Molotov was rewarded by Stalin for his support in the clash with Trotsky and his supporters with a succession of promotions to positions of increasing importance. In 1926, he was sent to Petrograd, which had long since been renamed Leningrad in honor of Stalin's predecessor, to oversee the dismantling of the support base of Grigory Zinoviev, a former ally of Stalin's that the new head of the Soviet Union now turned on as soon as Trotsky was out of the way. This done, in 1928, Molotov was placed in charge of the Communist Party in Moscow and reformed it over the next year. There, he delivered several speeches on the need to rapidly industrialize Russia's cities and towns, and was part of his involvement in the first five-year plan for agricultural collectivization and industrial development, which was launched by Stalin in 1928, and which Molotov played a part in both devising and implementing. Finally, in December 1930, Molotov was appointed to the position of chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Soviet Union, the position which Lenin had held prior to his death. Because of the peculiar structure of power-holding in the Soviet Union, it could be argued that this theoretically made him the head of state for the next 11 years, though in reality, power within the government from the mid-1920s onwards rested in Stalin's hands as General Secretary of the Communist Party. Nevertheless, the appointment of Molotov as chairman is indicative of how high he had risen within the Soviet Union by the beginning of the 1930s. The decade that followed would leave immense stains on Molotov's legacy. Two issues above all, his roles in the Soviet famine of the early 1930s and the Great Purge, stand out as particular black marks on his reputation. The Soviet famine of the early 1930s was one of several famines in the Soviet Union between the 1920s and 1940s, one often termed the Holodomor within a specifically Ukrainian context. Between 1930 and 1933, over 5 million people died in Ukraine, southwestern Russia, and other parts of the Soviet Union owing to food shortages brought about by the government's policies. The collectivization of agricultural production, and also the prioritization of food supplies for industrial workers in the cities and towns, led to the disaster. Molotov was deeply implicated in this, traveling in person to Ukraine and the Caucasus to enforce the government's orders to move grain supplies from the countryside into the towns. The faster Russia industrialized, the faster it would attain a perfect form of socialism and then complete communism, or so zealots like Molotov believed. It was this notion which led him to enforce policies in 1931 that deepened the crisis and led to further preventable deaths. As with most man-made famines of the 20th century, such as the Great Leap Forward in China in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Soviet government had not set out to create famine conditions in the early 1930s. But they became aware of what was happening owing to their ill-conceived policies before long, and figures like Molotov then exacerbated the famine by refusing to change course. Molotov's role in the Great Purge was also immensely unethical. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin engaged in a mass purging of the Communist Party within the Soviet Union, often removing a majority of individuals within leadership roles and governing committees in the Soviets of each region or city. In some instances, as many as 80% of the membership of certain councils was purged. Of those that were, the lucky ones were simply removed from their positions and banished from the Communist Party. Others were sent into internal exile, often to the Gulag labor camps in the cold, inhospitable East. Others still were placed on trial for alleged crimes and plotting against the state, and then executed. As the Great Purge escalated in 1937 and 1938, mass executions became more and more common. When combined with deaths in the labor camps, an estimated 1 million people are believed to have fallen victim to the Great Purge. Molotov, who may have feared suspicion after a rift developed between himself and Stalin in 1934, became complicit in the Great Purge, supporting Stalin's actions. Many decades later, he was still trying to justify his involvement, long after most Soviet officials had accepted that Stalin's purge had represented a tyrannical effort to crush any and all opposition to his dictatorship. In early May 1939, Molotov was appointed to the important position of Commissar of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, in succession to the out-of-favor Maxim Litvinov. It was a critical juncture to be promoted to the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs. Less than 2 months earlier, Nazi Germany had invaded and annexed Czechoslovakia, in violation of the Munich Agreement concluded with the British, French, and Italians in the Bavarian capital the previous September. With this, the Germans were in control of Central Europe, having already annexed Austria into a Greater Germany in March 1938. To anyone with a clear idea of Germany's ambitions, it was obvious that Poland was the next target of Hitler and the higher-ups within the Nazi setup. And once Poland was invaded or otherwise conquered, Germany would have a lengthy border with the USSR. Nazism and Bolshevism were ideological enemies, and Nazi rhetoric was filled with statements about destroying the communist specter that they suggested was haunting Europe. The question for Molotov as he assumed the position of Commissar of Foreign Affairs was how he would negotiate the situation as war loomed over Europe, with the British and French having made it clear that any violation of Polish independence would mean war. Molotov was soon negotiating intensely with his German counterpart, the Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The agreement stemmed from earlier efforts by the Germans to negotiate an economic treaty. Both sides might have considered the other to be an ideological enemy, but they had things like petroleum, iron, and automobiles that they wanted to buy from one another. In the summer of 1939, after Molotov's appointment, talks accelerated between the two foreign ministers and their staff, and there was soon progress towards not just a trade agreement, but a much more significant military and diplomatic pact. Eventually, on the 22nd of August, 1939, von Ribbentrop flew into Moscow and worked out the final elements of what was revealed the next day to the world as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the USSR. Governments were shocked to learn that the agreement involved a treaty of non-aggression between the Germans and Soviets just days before Germany would invade Poland, triggering the beginning of the Second World War in the process. Political leaders in London, Paris, and Washington would have been even more alarmed had they known of the secret clauses negotiated by Molotov and von Ribbentrop. These essentially outlined how Germany and the Soviet Union would carve up Eastern Europe between them once Germany had invaded Poland. The Soviets would claim the eastern parts of the country along with Finland and most of the Baltic states region. Thus, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact essentially was designed to allow the Soviets to reclaim the territories lost at the time of the Russian Civil War. Molotov's work was soon being realized militarily by Stalin. On the 17th of September, 1939, 2.5 weeks after the Nazis had invaded Poland from the west and with the Poles incurring heavy defeats to the Germans, the Soviets invaded the country from the east. Over the next 3 weeks, the sectors allotted to the Soviets under the agreement were occupied. Over time, the terms of the pact would be put into force in other ways. For instance, the Russians would invade the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and incorporate them into the Soviet Union. But Stalin waited until the summer of 1940, when most of the other major European states were wholly preoccupied with the German invasion of France and the Low Countries. Stalin also acquired some minor border territories around what is now Moldova, in a move which stretched the terms of the treaty Molotov had negotiated. In any event, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would not last that long. Eventually, with Western Europe conquered in May and June 1940, and with Hitler convinced that Britain would eventually join Germany against the common Bolshevik enemy, the Nazis began preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union early in 1941 and would launch Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June, 1941. Thus, Molotov's diplomatic deal lasted less than 2 years. But it was a major development in the first stages of the Second World War in Europe. One particular sphere of military activity for the Soviets that resulted from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is especially notable in terms of how Molotov's name became synonymous with homemade incendiaries. An element of the secret clauses was that the Soviets could invade and conquer Finland without the Germans objecting in any manner. After they had completed the military operation in eastern Poland in the late autumn, the Soviet Red Army was put into preparation for an invasion of Finland. The belief was that what became known as the Winter War would be a swift thing, one in which thinly populated Finland, with its small army, stood very little chance against the behemoth of the USSR. Stalin and his generals could not have been more wrong. The Finns offered determined resistance after the Red Army invaded their country at the very end of November 1939. Eventually, in mid-March, the Russians negotiated a face-saving peace agreement whereby some borderlands in Karelia were acquired by the Soviets. But in reality, the Finns had won the war by avoiding complete defeat and subjugation into the USSR. Eventually, the Finns would join in the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 and would be a key ally of the Nazis in the siege of Leningrad over nearly a 2.5-year period. It was in the midst of the Winter War that the term Molotov cocktail came into use to describe a makeshift petrol incendiary device that the Finns used extensively against the Russians. In the course of the 3.5-month war, the Soviets were at a distinct advantage in having large divisions of tanks, where the Finns barely had any mechanized cavalry. To counter this threat, the Finns began using incendiary devices where a mixture of petroleum and other flammable substances were placed in a glass flask of some kind, usually with a cloth or large wick that could be lit and then thrown, spreading flames outward when the glass shattered on impact. The environment, with Finland's many lakes and forests, was ideal for ambushing Russian tanks and launching these incendiary weapons at them. It was this which allowed the Finns to destroy hundreds of Russian armored vehicles. Reveling in the success of the weapon, the Finns developed a saying that they were sending Foreign Minister Molotov a cocktail to have with his meal. Such was the awareness that Molotov had negotiated the agreement with Germany that had led 3 months later to the Soviet invasion of Finland. Hence did this makeshift petrol bomb become known as the Molotov cocktail. Admittedly, Molotov's role in the Second World War became a bit more constructive once the Winter War had passed. In the course of 1940, the Germans turned their attentions westward and invaded and conquered Denmark and Norway in April, followed by the Low Countries and France in May and June. This left only the British standing against the Nazi menace, though Greece, too, was attempting a brave resistance against impossible odds in the Balkans, when the Nazi ally Fascist Italy was intent on creating a new Mediterranean empire. Then, a very poor strategic error was made by the Nazis in late 1940. Hitler turned his attention back eastwards and decided that the non-aggression pact that Molotov had negotiated with von Ribbentrop had served its purpose. After months of preparation in the first half of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion ever in human history, was launched on the 22nd of June, 1941, as 3 million German military personnel streamed into eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine, with the ultimate goal of taking Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad before advancing to the AA line, a strategic endpoint for the Germans in a line running from the port of Arkhangelsk on the shores of the White Sea in the north, to the Caspian port of Astrakhan in the south. A frequently overlooked detail of the invasion of the Soviet Union is that it was Molotov, as foreign minister, who made the radio declaration in the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, announcing that the Germans had invaded the USSR. He was also appointed by Stalin as deputy chairman of the hastily assembled State Defense Committee, meaning that Molotov was officially the second in command of the Soviet war effort, at least so far as the civil government went. Molotov's role now switched from maintaining a very fragile peace with Germany to overseeing a new alliance with Britain and the few countries that were at war with the Germans and their Axis allies. This initially involved a vault in Russian foreign policy, as tensions had been running high between Britain and the Soviets, in late 1939, 1940, and early 1941, had experienced serious tensions. The British had even considered sending an expeditionary force to Scandinavia to aid the Finns during the Winter War. Thus, Molotov had to patch things up in the autumn of 1941 with his British counterpart, Anthony Eden. This was easier said than done, as Molotov had become convinced that Eden was trying to orchestrate a joint Anglo-Turkish invasion of the Crimean Peninsula and southwestern Russia, after Eden had visited Istanbul early in 1941. Nevertheless, months later, Molotov undertook a risky flight over German airspace in the North Sea to land in Scotland as part of negotiations for what would become the first stages of the Allied alliance with the British. These negotiations quickly resulted in the Anglo-Soviet Agreement on the 12th of July, 1941, whereby the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union agreed to act in accord with one another against Germany, followed nearly a year later by a more detailed alliance. By then, the United States had also entered the war against the Germans and their Far Eastern ally, the Empire of Japan, after the well-known Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Molotov would be central to the subsequent negotiation of a wide range of diplomatic initiatives between the three leading Allied nations. Notably, the agreement between the US and the Soviets that Russia would declare war on Japan within 3 months of victory over Germany, in return for which, the US agreed to strategically prioritize the defeat of Germany before Japan. The US, British, and Soviets were allies during the Second World War, but they knew very well that a new clash was looming between the USSR and the Western powers once Germany, Japan, and their allies were defeated. Hence, the US and the Soviets carried out research into developing nuclear weapons during the war under a veil of secrecy. The US program, the Manhattan Project, and its ultimate results are well known. Less familiar is the Soviet program. This commenced in 1942 after the Russian physicist Georgy Flerov wrote to Stalin urging him to initiate a well-funded research program. Molotov was initially appointed to oversee the program, which was run from laboratories near Moscow. Unlike the US example, the Russian program was nearly entirely overseen by civilian administrators such as Molotov, and the lack of military personnel probably hampered its development. In any event, one of the primary impediments for the Russians was the same faced by the US and even the Nazis, the need for an adequate amount of fissile material. This was made more difficult for the Soviets by American attempts to restrict Russian access to uranium sources in the Congo and other regions. Where Molotov did make some progress was in attempting to establish spies in the US who could infiltrate the Manhattan Project. But Stalin nevertheless removed him from the project at the end of 1944 owing to its slow progress. Molotov's more important role between 1942 and 1945 was in negotiating the post-war world order at various diplomatic summits. Stalin, Churchill, and President Roosevelt often garner the majority of the attention in discussions of things like the Tehran and Yalta conferences. But Molotov, Eden, and figures like the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull made major contributions in their own right throughout. Molotov garnered a reputation as a tough negotiator at Tehran, Yalta, the post-war Potsdam Conference, and the San Francisco gathering where the United Nations was brought into being. Key points of contention tended to arise more between the British and the Russians, with the Americans often acting as arbitrators over thorny issues, such as the post-war status of Poland and Greece, two countries that Stalin was anxious to bring into the communist fold after the conflict. The Soviets succeeded when it came to Poland and accepted defeat in Greece. Through these negotiations and diplomatic meetings, Molotov struck an often paranoid figure. When visiting Britain in 1942, Molotov used to search his accommodation for bombs and slept with a revolver next to his bed, or so claimed Winston Churchill. After the war, when in Washington, D.C. to negotiate Soviet inclusion in the Lend-Lease program, whereby U.S. aid was extended to the countries directly impacted by the war in Europe, Molotov didn't just bring a revolver. He also brought his own food. The war came to an end in Europe in May 1945. It is well known that in the years that followed, the Western Allies rebuilt the economies of the countries which fell into the Western sphere of influence through the Marshall Plan, an initiative spearheaded by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall in 1948. What is usually completely overlooked is that the Marshall Plan was accompanied by the Molotov Plan, whereby financial and material aid was given to the newly communist countries of Eastern Europe to rebuild their economies after the devastation of the war. Constituent parts of the Soviet Union in Ukraine and elsewhere also benefited from it. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany all acquired aid through the Molotov Plan. The plan helped in the recovery and the beginning of a period in which many of the communist economies in Europe were about to enjoy growth levels which exceeded those found in many Western capitalist countries through the late 1940s and 1950s. However, the Molotov Plan was always contradictory. One of the tenets of the program Molotov devised in 1947 was that East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, all members of the Nazi-led Axis alliance during the war, should continue to pay war reparations to the Soviet Union. Despite being arguably the most prominent Soviet official of the 1940s, other than Stalin, at least in the civil sphere, Molotov's career took a downward turn at the end of the decade. The background to this was the 1948 visit of Golda Meir, a prominent Israeli politician who would become Prime Minister of Israel in 1969, to Moscow during the First Arab-Israeli War, to briefly act as Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union. Molotov's wife, Polina, was Jewish and spoke Yiddish. An incident in which he translated between Meir and Molotov, as Meir spoke Yiddish, subsequently became the basis for a paranoid claim that Polina had potentially engaged in treasonous behavior. Stalin had also long disliked Molotov's wife, Polina, had been arguably the last person with whom the dictator's second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, had conversed before she killed herself back in November 1932, leading Stalin to forever be suspicious of Mrs. Molotov. Now, 16 years later, she was sent into internal exile to a labor camp in the East for 5 years. Molotov was dismissed from his post as foreign minister not long afterwards in March 1949. Under Stalin's tyranny, there could be no possibility of strenuously opposing the decision. Vyacheslav simply had to accept what had happened and labored on as a more middling official for the next several years. It is an indication of how frail a figure Molotov could be that he would continue to defend Stalin's legacy and methods long after the dictator was dead, even though, in the final years of his life, Stalin had been in all essential ways tearing apart Molotov's career, preparing to remove him permanently from the Soviet leadership, as well as sending his wife to a labor camp. In 1952 and into early 1953, Stalin had made it clear that Molotov was finished within the leadership and was preparing to dismiss him from most of his offices, possibly violently. What saved the former foreign minister was the death of Stalin himself on the 5th of March, 1953, after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage 4 days earlier. After a complex power struggle, one in which Molotov was never seriously in contention, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as Stalin's successor. Khrushchev had been challenged by Georgy Malenkov, who became premier for 2 years down to 1955, but who was quickly undermined by Khrushchev in 1953 and only allowed to remain as premier in a largely ceremonial capacity thereafter. Nevertheless, during the power struggle, Malenkov had briefly held sufficient enough power to realign the senior ministries. And on the 5th of March, 1953, the very day Stalin died, Molotov had been reappointed as Minister of Foreign Affairs. He continued to hold the position after Khrushchev's ascent, though it was evident before long that Molotov's unrepentant Stalinist views were out of sync with the new atmosphere in the Kremlin, where Khrushchev was denouncing the former tyrant and attempting to move away from the worst excesses of the Stalinist era. Molotov was removed from the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs for the final time in June 1956, a move that came as little surprise after Khrushchev had denounced Stalin's foreign policy at the start of the Second World War and, by implication, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that Molotov had negotiated. Thereafter, he joined secretly with Malenkov and the deputy premier of the USSR, Lazar Kaganovich, to begin plotting to remove Khrushchev from power. The trio and their allies would become known as the Anti-Party Group, a collection of unreformed Stalinists who were unhappy with the drift of Soviet politics and foreign policy under Khrushchev. On the 18th of June, 1957, they attempted to overthrow Stalin's successor through diplomatic means, forcing a vote on his leadership at the 11-man party Presidium, which they won by 7 votes to 4. However, Khrushchev managed to argue successfully that a vote needed to be held within the larger Central Committee of the Communist Party. There, he managed to convince a sufficient number of individuals that the Anti-Party Group, which he referred to them as, was an unreformed group of Stalinists with blood on their hands. In the end, the attempted coup collapsed when Khrushchev won over the support of the war hero and Minister of Defense, Georgy Zhukov, who stated that the Red Army would oppose the attempted coup of Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich. The anti-party group had failed. With the foiling of the attempted coup in the summer of 1957, Molotov was not entirely purged from the Bolshevik leadership. It was a sign of how much things had changed in Russia. Had the men involved taken this course of action 5 years earlier under Stalin, every one of them would have been quickly killed. Instead, in 1957, Khrushchev decided to remove those who had attempted to overthrow him in less dramatic ways. For instance, Malenkov was sent to manage a power plant in what is now Kazakhstan. Molotov was dispatched even further east, though on the surface of it, his appointment as Soviet ambassador to the Mongolian People's Republic was a face-saving one. Nobody was fooled, though. Even the New York Times, in reporting on Molotov's dispatch to Ulaanbaatar on the 7th of September, 1957, referred to him as the fallen Soviet leader. It must be said it was a slightly more exalted fate than that Malenkov had been consigned to, or indeed Kaganovich, the latter of whom was sent to manage a potash factory in the Ural Mountains region. Conversely, this was a period of important diplomacy in Ulaanbaatar, as relations with Mongolia fluctuated owing to the wider Sino-Soviet split between the Soviets and the Chinese. Molotov was also appointed to the position of Soviet representative at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, in the late 1950s. If Molotov's appointment as ambassador to Mongolia and as Soviet representative of the IAEA were face-saving measures in the late 1950s, complete disgrace was soon to follow. Khrushchev had felt as though his position was not strong enough after the attempted coup in 1957 to completely purge the anti-party group leaders from the Soviet establishment, and had exiled them instead to Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and the Urals. By the autumn of 1961, when the 22nd Party Congress was convened, his position was much stronger. Following the success of the Cuban Revolution, the initiation of the construction of the Berlin Wall just weeks earlier, Russian successes in the burgeoning space race with the US, and also the imminent testing of the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, one which was 1,500 times stronger than the nuclear weapon dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. With his position more powerful now, Khrushchev furthered his de-Stalinization program at the 22nd Congress. This included making preparations for the complete expulsion of several of the leaders of the anti-party group from the Communist Party, Molotov included, and their removal from any offices which they held. The expulsions were carried out quietly and with little fanfare in 1962. In the months that followed, efforts were being systematically undertaken to expunge the record of Molotov's role in the Soviet regime over the last 4.5 decades, with his papers and departmental files being destroyed under Khrushchev's orders. Molotov spent many years in complete exile from the Soviet movement and leadership, though he was allowed to return to Moscow and lived out much of his later life in the Russian capital. Even the overthrow of Khrushchev in October 1964, after a number of incidents, not least his backing down at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, failed to result in Molotov being rehabilitated and brought back into the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev. He was allowed to live in quiet retirement. He appears to have spent much of the 1960s writing his memoirs, but they would never see the light of day. Nevertheless, from 1969 onwards down to his death in 1986, Molotov met on many occasions with the Soviet biographer Felix Chuev, who compiled a dossier of hundreds of pages of interview records based on these conversations. This was subsequently published in 1991 as the Soviet Union was collapsing as Stodny bez politiki, 100 Conversations with Molotov. The book was published 2 years later in English translation as Molotov Remembers, Inside Kremlin Politics. It is considered an invaluable source on the inner workings of the Soviet regime between 1917 and 1957. Its author would never return to the political fold, although when the 1983 Soviet Encyclopedic Dictionary was published, Molotov was given a 17-line entry in which his accomplishments were noted. This compared favorably with the 14 lines given for Khrushchev's entry. In the summer of 1984, Konstantin Chernenko, who served for just over a year as head of the Soviet Union in 1984 and early 1985, very quietly reinstated the 94-year-old Molotov as a member of the Communist Party. By the time he was reinstated in 1984, Molotov was a very old and ill man, and the restoration of him to the communist fold was clearly a token gesture by the regime. At the end of his life, he had suffered many heart attacks, the first seemingly as early as January 1954, when he had been too unwell to attend a high-level summit with the foreign ministers of the US, Britain, and France. It is believed that he had 7 heart attacks in all, but the number is disputed as Soviet propaganda tried to cover these up at certain times. Given this, it was something of a miracle that he survived as long as he did and lived to the ripe old age of 96, when he died in Moscow on the 8th of November, 1986. He was the second-to-last senior surviving participant of the Russian Revolution that had taken place nearly 7 decades earlier, outlasted only by Kaganovich, who died in 1991 at 97 years of age. Molotov's funeral and interment at the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow 5 days later was a small and largely private affair, attended by about 200 mourners. There was no government ceremony, and efforts were made to ensure it was very thinly covered in both the domestic and international media. Molotov could not have known it at the time, but his lifetime would largely bookend the Soviet system. He had been born back in 1890 at a time when the Russian communist movement was just beginning to take off. He died as it was being dismantled. Mikhail Gorbachev had taken over as head of the Soviet Union not long before Molotov's passing and quickly began initiating a series of policy programs designed to reform the USSR and the communist system, specifically by opening the economy up more and liberalizing the political system. This program had unintended consequences. In the course of 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe began to collapse under mass protests and civil disobedience. By 1990, the difficulties had spread to Russia itself. In the 2 years that followed, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, then the USSR, and finally the communist system itself within Russia. A decade of chaos ensued. In the course of it, much reflection was undertaken on the three-quarter-of-a-century-long Soviet experiment. It was generally concluded that the Stalinist era had constituted a complete moral stain on Soviet history. Molotov, as one of Stalin's lackeys and orchestrators of much of his foreign policy, did not escape with his reputation intact. Vyacheslav Molotov was one of the most important members of the leadership of the Soviet Union between the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the end of his own career as a senior figure within the Bolshevik movement 40 years later. However, longevity is not necessarily a mark of success when discussing this time and place. Almost no other figure within the Soviet setup, other than Stalin himself, managed to survive through these decades. Nearly everyone else was sidelined or demoted as Stalin rose to power in the 1920s, engaged in the Great Purge in the 1930s, or demoted anyone that might challenge his preeminent position as Russia's wartime leader in the 1940s. The fact that Molotov managed to survive and hold senior positions throughout these decades points toward his fawning nature and complicity in Stalin's crimes. Few other Soviet officials survived at the top of the Politburo in this way or managed to make their mark on history. Yet even when it comes to Molotov's alleged accomplishments, these are hardly good things. His foremost success was in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, which freed up Nazi Germany to initiate the Second World War just over a week later and began the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe that would last for half a century. He remained an unrepentant Stalinist down to his last days, despite the fact that Stalin clearly wasn't very fond of him. His foremost legacy is that a homemade fire grenade was ironically named after him by Russia's enemies in Finland in the winter of 1939 and 1940.